Hey, this is Blighted Pine Books, and today we're going to be taking a look at Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. All right, so this is Jane Austen's second novel, Pride and Prejudice. It was published in 1813, and it is considered a novel of manners. A novel of manners essentially recreates like a social world of customs, values, and mores, and a stratified society, and then it examines to what degree the characters in the novel meet or fail to meet the uniform expectations that are established by society or the culture at large. So if you don't already know, I think this book is certainly one of the most famous, though it's my first experience with Jane Austen. Just a little bit of the plot. So essentially it follows a character named Elizabeth Bennet. And she traverses the upper class of Regency England throughout the novel, and she spurns the proposal of a first and unwanted cousin named Mr. Collins. She settles ultimately on a negative impression of Fitzwilliam Darcy, who is her second suitor and love interest, learns of her first false impression of him and eventually falls in love with him and accepts his proposal. That's pretty much the whole novel. So on a superficial level, it's a novel about the repercussions of hasty judgments against an individual. Elizabeth's family, they live on an estate. All of the characters in this novel are extraordinarily wealthy, and they all live on fairly large estates, though Elizabeth's family lives on a somewhat smaller estate than the other characters, called Longbourn in Hertfordshire, England. Has 5 daughters, and Mrs. Bennet is anxiously preoccupied with the courting of her daughters. Because of the patriarch, his name, Mr. Bennet, is a kind of lackadaisical and sardonic individual. He's been somewhat irresponsible with his family's finances. His wife has no inheritance, and so the financial situation of all of these suitors is of paramount importance to the daughters and to the anxious Miss Bennet herself. The novel opens with the arrival of this charming and wealthy guy named Mr. Bingley, who comes from Netherfield Estate, a slightly larger estate, and he begins this influx of anxieties and interests from the perspective of Mrs. Bennet. So the novel focuses on the various reactions that Elizabeth and her sisters have to these prospective engagements, social condemnations that they experience, but ultimately it's a novel about Elizabeth and her independent nature and her refusal to accept any marriage that lacks a mutual respect, both emotional and intellectual. So that's pretty much the plot. It's not an extraordinarily complicated novel, though there's certainly more than what I went into in this review. But I think as the novel is so well known and there's so many televised and film depictions of this book, you're probably already familiar with it, to be honest. Just some observations that I made in reading the book. First of all was the descriptions, or rather the lack thereof. This is my first experience with Jane Austen. I had really nothing to go on so far as her writing style was concerned, and what I found most interesting was this absence of description. The setting itself is mostly implied. If it's either a ballroom or a library, it's left almost entirely to the imagination, with no descriptions of colors, of the curtains, or the what the English countryside might look like out the window. There's pretty much nothing there. And so whenever Jane Austen does highlight it, it's of real importance. So the novel is told through this third person limited perspective. And that though it's in third person, it's certainly not objective, and even all of the observations made by the narrator are seemingly through the protagonist's perspective. And I think that Jane Austen, this is, again, my first time reading her, she seems to be a really astute observer of like verbal inflections of different people, and each character has their own distinctive voice, and that's what I thought was so impressive about her writing style. And so some of the characters, like the absurd Mr. Collins, he's kind of a ridiculous individual who lacks a lot of forethought in his actions and his words, and so his speeches themselves, and he gives like many very lengthy speeches. They're all like absurd and secular and overwrought, and they capture his like foolish yet haughty nature. There's Mr. Bennet, who's like this distant and ironic individual, and even his reaction to Elizabeth's rejection of Mr. Collins's proposal captures his persona. He says something like, if you decide to marry Mr. Collins, I'll never speak to you again, and if you don't marry him, your mother will never speak to you again. Neither of these options does he take very seriously, as he kind of knows that his wife's threats are empty and emotionally charged. And so even his actions themselves are like very indicative of his personality in total. And then there's the infamous Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is the novel's closest thing to an antagonist. And she speaks in these like sharp, biting phrases that capture her sense of superiority and selfishness. So that's what I thought was the coolest thing about this book, was just how well Jane Austen develops characters, and she does so not through description, but rather through their actions and through their words. It's really impressive. A couple other things about the book was, one, it's such an old book that you really, as I was reading it, I was going into kind of analysis mode, and so there were like two primary lenses that I was viewing the book through, and the first is the most obvious, which is like the feminist perspective, and so the introduction of this book cites two predominant feminists of her time, that being Hannah More and Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft argued for the intellectual and social equality of women, promoting education and a role in public life, with a focus on reason and a rejection of the idea that a woman's role is primarily to please men. Hannah More, on the other hand, was a conservative reformer and a Christian evangelical who focused on improving women's moral and spiritual roles rather than demanding equality. She believed in women's education and development, but in service to her role as a wife and a mother rather than in service to herself. Ultimately, she remained pretty critical of Wollstonecraft's more radical ideas that threatened the social order. Now, what's sort of interesting is where Jane Austen stands in all of this, which is that she kind of synthesizes these two perspectives, right? And so the book is argued, at least in the introduction, that it's a synthesis of these two polemic feminists of her age. And despite the fact that her protagonist is certainly more of a Wollstonecraftian feminist than a Morean feminist. So yeah, the feminist lens, I think, is the most interesting one to look at. And it's interesting that Jane Austen lands somewhat in the middle, but leaning Wollstonecraft in this novel. The other lens that I was thinking about while reading this book was the psychological. And despite the fact that women were extremely limited in Regency England, Austen's now famous protagonist chooses personal happiness. And so in the humble opinion of Blighted Pine Books here, it's Elizabeth's personality that I think carries this book into the 21st century. Reading a lot of classics, I always ask myself, like, okay, like why did this book live through the ages, and like why is it still relevant today? And I think that it's really Elizabeth that carries this book, because like in the face of this like hyper stratified society with these immeasurable demands, both physical and psychological upon women, she remains an enlightenment figure, a rational woman, a distance woman, yet still fundamentally feminine. So while the types of limitations that exist in modern society are vastly different than they were for the aristocracy in Regency England, the fundamental question of one's personal happiness against the standards of society and the expectations of family remain equally weighty. In Austen, a woman who never married and who chose intellectual life over traditional and familial expectations speaks to the modern reader. And ultimately, Jane Austen implores us to choose happiness. So just some final thoughts on the book. This was my first experience with Jane Austen. It was definitely a positive one. Her characters, I think, are the standout feature of the book, with each given a distinctive voice and depth that's uncommon even in modern literature. I was somewhat emotionally unaffected while I read the book, as spending my time with the super wealthy of Regency England began to grate against me a little bit. I was wondering, like, do these people ever go to work? There seem to be no real consequences in the novel for any of the characters, and no real poverty exists. Whereas later writers like Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy explore the real suffering of the lower classes, and illness, poverty, and death loom over every page. Austen remains comfortably shielded from these lower class ordeals. So despite these criticisms, I don't think readers turn to Austen for these reasons, and I will certainly be back for more. So those are my thoughts on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me. And if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe below. And have a really excellent day. Thanks.